Azure versus AWS for startups, 5 costs most teams miss. Welcome back. Today's topic is Azure versus AWS for startups, 5 costs most teams miss. We'll cover what you actually need to know about Microsoft Azure versus AWS for startups. Now, moving on to why Microsoft Azure versus AWS for startups is more complex than a price sheet. Most cloud pricing comparison posts show you a table of VM sizes. That's useful, but it misses how your actual bill gets assembled. AWS and Azure both charge for compute, storage, and bandwidth, but the way they bundle, discount, and meter these services creates significant cost differences depending on how your startup actually uses the cloud. A startup running mostly Windows workloads will almost certainly pay less on Azure. A startup building microservices in Node.js with heavy object storage usage might get a better deal on AWS. The honest answer is, it depends, and the 5 costs below are where that dependency plays out most. Let's start with the one that surprises almost every team. Next up, moving on to cost number 1, data egress fees, the bill that keeps climbing. Data egress is what you pay when data leaves the cloud provider's network. Neither AWS nor Azure advertises this number prominently, but it can represent 15 to 25% of a growing startup's monthly cloud bill. Here is how the numbers stack up in 2026. On paper, nearly identical. The difference shows up in how each platform meters egress between services within the same region. AWS charges for data moving between availability zones within the same region at 1 cent per gigabyte each direction. Azure does not charge for traffic between availability zones in the same region. Next up, cost number 2, support plans, where AWS gets expensive fast. This is the most consistently overlooked line item in any AWS versus Azure cost comparison for startups. AWS developer support starts at $29 per month. But that tier only covers one contact and excludes production system issues. If you want business hours support for production problems, AWS Business Support costs 10% of your monthly bill, with a $100 minimum. On a $3,000 per month AWS bill, that's $300 per month in support costs, or $3,600 per year. Azure's comparable developer support plan also starts at $29 per month. But Azure offers something AWS doesn't match, the Microsoft for Startups program, which provides up to $150,000 in Azure credits over 2 years, plus access to technical advisory support, GitHub Enterprise, and Microsoft 365. Many eligible startups never claim it. Let's talk about moving on to cost number 3, Azure Reserved Instances versus AWS Savings Plans for startups. Both platforms offer significant discounts for committing to capacity upfront. The structure matters more than the headline discount percentage. Azure Reserved Instances let you commit to a specific VM size for 1 or 3 years, with discounts up to 72% off pay-as-you-go pricing. You can scope reservations to a subscription group, which is useful when running dev, staging, and production in separate subscriptions. AWS savings plans are more flexible. You commit to a dollar amount of compute usage per hour, and AWS applies the discount across any EC2 instance type, Lambda, or Fargate usage. That flexibility matters if you're still iterating on your architecture. Next up, let's talk about cost number 4, Microsoft 365 integration, where Azure wins for most startup teams. This cost is less obvious, but it's real money for startups already using Teams, SharePoint, or Office 365. Azure's native integration with Microsoft's productivity suite eliminates entire categories of middleware cost. Connecting a Power Automate workflow to SharePoint, Dynamics 365, or Teams takes minutes with native connectors. On AWS, you'd need third-party integration tools, Lambda functions bridging the gap, or custom development time. Development time is a real cost. At $75 to $150 per hour for a developer, 3 days of integration work on AWS that Azure handles natively costs $1,800 to $3,600 per integration project. Run 2 or 3 of these integrations in your first year and the gap becomes significant. Next up, now, cost number 5, compliance and regulatory costs for fintech and banking startups. This is where the Microsoft Azure versus AWS for startups comparison gets industry-specific, and where Azure has the clearest structural advantage for regulated sectors. Both platforms are SOC 2, ISO 27001, and PCI DSS certified. But the compliance tooling costs differ in ways most startups don't account for. Azure, Microsoft Defender for Cloud is included at a foundational level with any Azure subscription. Enhanced Defender plans run approximately $0.02/server/hour. Azure Policy, which enforces compliance rules automatically across resources, is free. Let's talk about Azure versus AWS feature comparison for startups, a direct breakdown. Beyond the hidden costs, here's how the platforms compare on the features that matter most to startup teams in 2026. Both platforms are mature. The choice often comes down to your existing tooling, team experience, and where your data already lives. For a broader three-way comparison that includes Google Cloud, Azure versus AWS versus Google Cloud, which saves startups more? Breaks down the specific scenarios where each platform wins on total cost. According to Flexera's State of the Cloud report, startups under $1 million ARR that consolidate on a single cloud platform typically reduce operational overhead by 20 to 30% compared to teams trying to manage multi-cloud from the start. Now, next up, how to choose the right cloud platform for your startup. The Microsoft Azure versus AWS for startups decision typically comes down to 4 clear questions. Does your team already use Microsoft 365? If yes, Azure's integration advantages are immediate. You'll spend less on middleware, less on custom development, and your team will hit the ground running with familiar tools. Are you running Windows workloads? Azure Hybrid Benefit can reduce Windows VM costs by up to 40%. On AWS, you're paying full Windows licensing on top of compute costs. Now, next up, conclusion. The Microsoft Azure versus AWS for startups comparison is not a question with one universal right answer, but the 5 costs in this post are where real money gets lost or saved. Data egress between availability zones, support plan pricing, the Azure Hybrid Benefit on reserved instances, Microsoft 365 integration overhead, and compliance tooling costs add up to thousands of dollars per year in differences that don't appear on any standard pricing calculator. For startups already in the Microsoft ecosystem, building Windows workloads, or operating in regulated industries, Azure typically comes out cheaper in total cost of ownership. For AWS native teams building entirely on Linux with no Microsoft tooling, the advantage is less clear-cut and team familiarity becomes the deciding factor. The best move is to model your specific workload against both platforms using these 5 cost categories as your checklist before committing. If you want help running that analysis, our team works with startups and SMBs on cloud cost modeling and Azure architecture, so you go in with clear numbers rather than billing surprises 3 months later.